So, as you all know, I'm June, and I am going to be doing a presentation over the people who are in prison who have been involved in uprisings over the last couple of years. I do two different case studies, one over the Holmen uprisings that have occurred this past March, and another one that occurred in a criminal alien requirement facility in Wiles County, Texas in February of 2015. And so, to analyze these two case studies, I used the method of the Pentad, which was developed by Kenneth Burke. I'll go ahead and apply that to the case studies. And the question that I'm kind of trying to answer is, what were the conditions, social and in the prison, that led to the riots or uprisings? What are the prisoners trying to communicate to the prison officials and the general public through the riots? And so, just to give a little bit of background on the Pentad, pictured here is Kenneth Burke. He is the inventor of the Pentad. He uses it in a method he calls dramatism. Essentially, his argument is that essentially the world is a stage. This does not necessarily mean that while this kind of means that everything is a performance, the focus isn't necessarily supposed to be on the metaphors, but rather the stage itself as a literal thing and what that necessarily means. And so the point of that is he's trying to understand human motives and motivation. And so he comes up with a Pentad, essentially saying that if we are to outline these 5 things, then we'll have the best understanding for human motivation. And so the 5 things are the scene, essentially the setup that goes into the act of being what happened within the rhetorical situation, the agent, or actor, depending on who you read, the same thing. But essentially who did the act, agency is how it gets done, purpose is why it happens. There are also assigned different philosophic values to it. So for example, the scene is supposed to be a realist sort of understanding. The agency is something that's supposed to be more idealistic, things like that. There's different philosophies that correspond to it, which we'll get to later when we analyze the ratios. So, wait a second for it to switch over. There we go. So the first rhetorical artifact that I'm going to be talking about is the Holmen Uprisings that happened this past March. And here are a couple pictures that were taken from within the prison while it was occurring. And it's kind of to demonstrate that, while there is, fire being set, throughout, the video that was posted to Facebook and, the pictures, you kind of see that people aren't attacking each other. They're attacking the building. But, a little more background information is essentially... Oh, there we go. Oh, so it just takes time for it to show up on here. Okay. Mm-hmm. So... essentially what happened is around 9 o'clock on March 12th, there was a fight in between inmates, and allegedly an officer went to go and break it up, then was stabbed. That led to the warden, and coming in with backup, the warden also got stabbed. However, if we look to what the prisoners say happened in this situation, by the time the CO had already came to break the fight up, the fight was already done. And so what ended up happening was he was cursing out the prisoners and flipping bunks over for no reason, just because essentially he could. And so when he was yelling at one of the more trusted prisoners who was kind of acted as a liaison, he started yelling at that person. That essentially is what triggered kind of the enough is enough. Dude got stabbed. And then essentially when the warden came in, he essentially did the same thing, was yelling at the prisoners, flipping things over. And so the prisoners decided that he was to be stabbed as well, took over the cell block and started setting fires. And essentially they were protesting the bad conditions that were occurring in this facility. So some of the things that were happening is there was massive medical negligence. In 2014, a person with hepatitis C died because they refused to provide the person with medical treatment. In 2015, there was a gastrointestinal outbreak that occurred throughout the prison that could have been prevented had they actually had access to medical attention. There's also been various abuses that have been documented. For example, the warden previously at the old prison that he was at St. Clair in Alabama, he basically over his time there, the violence increased over 200%, and the prison went from being the least violent prison in Alabama to literally being the prison with the most murder rates in the country. And essentially, if you listen to people both in Holmen and in St. Clair, their response to this massive increase in violence is both the warden and the officers telling the prisoners to get a knife, essentially. And so there was the way in which the prisoners in the Holmen incident were able to capitalize on the media attention that they kind of got was to issue a list of demands while they were had the control of the facility. And the demands were, they had 6 total. The first was immediate federal assistance to all the prisoners. The second was any inmate that had spent excessive time in Holmen was to be released because of the massive abuses that had occurred, probably equals time served. The next is that parole for all those who are eligible. In Alabama, there's a massive prison overcrowding problem, and there's a court clogging problem. And so even though 25% of the prison population in Alabama is eligible for parole, it doesn't happen because there just isn't people to necessarily to process it, and so they get left behind in prison. They want to repeal the repeat offender laws. That essentially is just like you have life in prison if you have previous offenses. They also want classes that focus on rehabilitation. That way they're able to integrate back into society, and monetary compensation for mental and physical abuses. And so when we apply the Pentad to the Holmen riots, what we kind of see in the scene is you first have to understand the prison industrial complex, and I think to understand that necessarily requires a historical analysis of how it came to be. And so essentially, as you kind of, as Michelle Alexander kind of articulates within the new Jim Crow, you see these sort of like restrictions that happen against Black people within the eras of obviously slavery, then Reconstruction, and then Jim Crow, and it's kind of assumed in our new colorblind society that these problems are no longer the case, but rather what has happened is there has been a shift into using prisons as the method of control instead of outright like racism. So for example, she gives is that prisons work strikingly similarly like things like Jim Crow. So because ex-convicts are not allowed to vote, that necessarily prevents like 13% of the Black population in America from voting, which is strikingly similar, she says, to poll taxes and literacy tests of the 1960s. And you also see a rapid increase in the prison population within the 80s and the 90s. That it goes from like 100 to 200,000 up into the millions, which is a strikingly increase. And like we understand this to be something that is the result of prisons and drug laws versus actually crime. Crime actually has decreased, but rather prison and incarceration has rapidly increased, which has led to the targeting of people of color, particularly Black people. Also part of this scene is essentially the horrible conditions that are in the Holmen prison. So what I've talked about the warden, about the warden, and then the medical and like general conditions of the prisons all are all a part of this scene that allowed for the act to take place. So for example, the act of the riot or the uprising, or however you want to think about it, doesn't happen because if those two things don't happen, right? You can't reach the point of enough is enough without the horrible conditions in the prison industrial complex. The agent is obviously going to be the prisoners who participated in this. The agency are the makeshift weapons and the fire that was used, and the items they used to barricade themselves from the rest of the prison. And the purpose is very blatantly to protest the conditions as was indicated by their listing of demands. The second rhetorical artifact or rhetorical situation that I analyzed was a riot that occurred in the Wiley County facility in Texas. And so I got these pictures from the American Civil Liberties Union Warehouse and Forgotten report, and some pictures the Nation had got in right after the prison riot had taken place. And so what you can see here is that they essentially tried to burn the facility down. The facility is only made out of Kevlar, like as in like bulletproof jackets. The same material is just made to make these tents. And so that kind of is what happened. They were trying to have a peaceful protest in the courtyard about the medical conditions in the facility, and they were met with riot gear. And so what ended up happening was they took control of it and they tried to burn the facility down. A little bit of background information about like why car prisons are a little distinct from other forms of prisons is that it's basically essentially an intersection between the prison industrial complex and the criminalization of immigration, or the immigration system. And so you can kind of see that in the 1996 Congress passes an illegal immigration reform, an Immigration Responsibility Act. Essentially, that was also a part of like the Welfare Reform and Prison Reforms Act that was happening at the same time. And essentially, it increased the number of deportable offenses, and it also increased how hard it was essentially to enter the country illegally. And so then also in 2003, the director of detention and removal, Anthony Tannen, released a strategic memo program. Essentially, as Dottie and Wheatley kind of indicate, it was essentially to try and deport everybody, was essentially the plan. And then in a memo 2 years later that was released, Operation Streamline, essentially, previously there was a catch and release policy. Basically, you catch somebody on illegal entry or re-entry, you deport them, and that's it. Post this, they are sent through immigrant detention facilities, through car facilities, etc., and put into the legal system in that sort of way. And that led to the need for the creation of like shadow private prisons, which led to criminal alien requirement prisons. Essentially, the GOE group and CCA Corporation own the 13 facilities that are currently operating. They're for-profit prisons. The conditions are really bad. In point of fact, like the ACLU report kind of outlines the fact that like people aren't really even allowed access to things like lawyers because of the way the private prisons are set up. And so when we apply the Pentad to the car prison riots, we have to necessarily look at the current rhetorical situation surrounding immigration and prison reform. So essentially, the idea that we consistently mark immigrants, particularly from Latin America, as illegal, things of that nature. The legal apparatus, i.e. the way in which the immigration system is broken, that necessitates people to immigrate illegally because the system is just broken. And then the conditions in the prison that led to them wanting to peacefully protest that later led into violence. The act, of course, is the riot. The agent is the prisoners. The agency are the guards with the riot gear because they're actually what initiate that sort of violence, which is a little bit distinct from the Holmen instance, and also the prisoners fighting back and setting the fires. And the purpose, I still contend, would be prisoners protesting the inhumane conditions that they are forced to live in. And so here is now where we kind of started getting the breakdown of these sort of methods. And so within the field of rhetoric, the idea that violence can be used as a method is kind of taboo. So kind of as Crosswhite outlines, is the very origin of rhetoric was actually a means to avoid violence. It was used for persuasion and things of that nature. But then that doesn't necessarily mean that rhetoric can't be violent or elicit violence, as we see that rhetoric can be violent in terms of framing of minoritarian populations, and it can elicit violence, as we see with Donald Trump in the way in which he presents himself in his politics. However, I think that the thing that needs to be recognized is that the process of rhetoric is necessarily creating a message in the message itself. And so if we can understand that the riots had a purpose, it probably proves that it is a form of rhetoric in itself, even if they're using violence to enact that message. And so with the car facility riots, in a news report from, I believe, Vice that Hamilton did, it kind of showed that the inmates in the CAR facility were thinking about using violence, particularly fire, as an act of protest even months before the incident happened, which was further backed up by Takaki, who was the ACL lawyer who co-authored Warehouse and Forgotten, who said the only thing that stopped people from doing that was the feeling that if they burned the tents down, their company would just build them back up again. But eventually they were pushed beyond that point anyway. And the Holmen Uprisings, while it was a spontaneous incident, it still fits the criteria because it was a response to Enough is Enough, which was an article that kind of Lip had within, I believe it was Vice. They used cell phones to show the conditions of the prison, to provide context as to what was going on. They then used this platform later to issue a set of demands. And they're also using that they're also in the process of using that for their labor strike as well, which I believe started 2 days ago, and there is going to be a prison nationwide labor strike, I believe, starting on September 9th. And so here's where we start kind of talking about the ratios and the implications. And so the ratios for both of the riots is going to be a scene-act ratio, which necessarily means that the act was a result of the scene. And so, as Jarvin and Miller kind of indicate, scene-act ratios represent the logics for connecting events, people, and objects into coherent orientations in social reality. So essentially, it provides context for the acts that happened. We can have historical analysis to understand and provide context for people's motivations as to why they would have acts. It also means that the scene controls the conditions for the act. It also, when you use the scene act, when you're able to focus on the scene, then you're able to understand the conditions and who is responsible for those conditions. So in the instance of the prison population, it would be necessarily the way in which institutions have historically been formed and consistently adjusted structurally to consistently trap minority populations within the prison system. And so, what is interesting to note is that while the scene sets up the act and the act is what's focused on in their drama and the rhetorical situation, there is a less of a focus on both the scene and the agent. So, for example, when the media consistently puts out and only reports there is a riot next prison, there is a riot next prison, it necessarily that's only the thing that people then focus on. They don't, and so when there's that focus on the act as the main focus, then it allows for the scene to be forgotten, and it further allows for the agent or the people within the prisons to be forgotten about as well. Which kind of leads me to my implication part of it, is that when you're able to do that, that allows for the consistent narrative to be reaffirmed that prisoners are violent, that they need to be controlled, that they are a threat to society because they're only pictured as rioting. Their sense of humanity is erased away from that as them as acting agents. It's also ignored it also allows people to ignore the historical conditions that led to the United States having the biggest prison population in the world. It's also, when we look at it as a riot, as an act of rhetoric, we're able to determine what message that the prisoners wanted to convey with the rhetorical act of the riot. So when we're able to break everything down, we're kind of able to see that the overall motivation for this, for the prisoners acting in this, is essentially that these conditions are bad and they're not livable. And so that's what we keep seeing, particularly recently, more of these uprisings and prisoner sort of movements with the labor strikes, and essentially what we can see is that that's set in the scene and is the result of historical legacies of oppression. Additionally, I think that one of the implications that comes from this is that the use of violence is a legitimate and justifiable means of protest and resistance. And so I think that the first example of that would be in the condition of the car prison riots. None of the officers were targeted, but rather they targeted the property to destroy it in order so they didn't have to be there anymore. That while an act of violence is still clearly justifiable because they're put in situations, right? And even in the instance of the Holmen prison riot, you see that there are literally guards who are guards and the warden who are reinforcing the violent conditions that they are forced to live in. And so at that point, when they're trying to retake over the prison, that is a means of self-defense and is actually justified. And so those are kind of the implications that I had come to after analyzing the scene and act. Here is a works cited. Are there questions and stuff?
I'll go ahead and stop it.